My turn, Yugi boy. I knew you would, Yugi boy. Yugi boy, Yugi boy. Whatever you say, Yugi boy. Yugi boy, Yugi boy.
So before we get started, I just wanted to say I'm feeling a fair bit better, and if you missed it and missed the video I made on it, I broke my nose and I had like 9 stitches here because I had an accident at football training, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who's like reached out and had nice comments to me. I really appreciate it, and I'll hopefully get my nose fixed next week. So sorry if I'm a bit hard to look at, but let's get into the video. So basically the internet's biggest podcast is the Joe Rogan Experience, and numerous people from all sorts of political affiliations or just general backgrounds go on his show. You have people like Mike Tyson, Louis Theroux, you have people like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, you have people like Jimmy Dore, Carl Kalinske, David Pakman, Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, and of course lately even Bernie Sanders. So in this video I just want to discuss if I think Joe Rogan is either good for left and progressive politics or bad for them. Now I kind of have mixed opinions, because if you exclusively listen to Joe Rogan interviewing, I guess, leftist figures, he comes across as very reasonable. Now he had a great interview with Dr. Cornel West. I think it's one of my favourite episodes because I'd never heard Cornel West speak this long, and it was just a really enjoyable discussion. And I think Joe did a good job in interviewing him and bringing out all these great points. And Cornel West is obviously a very, I guess, a man who's filled with love because he doesn't really hate anyone, and I kind of like the way he calls everyone brother. But that was a great interview. And then he has a nice dynamic with all his guests in terms of he does come across as very friendly, he lets them talk, and I guess his interview style is not very confrontational, which I do have a problem with, but I think when you're platforming a lot of these leftist people, it's not so bad. He does sometimes push back and bring up opposition arguments, but not as much as, you know, other podcasts or other interviews, because I guess that's not his style, especially with how casual he gets with some of the topics, and he smokes weed on his podcast and everything like that. So yeah, at the end of the day, I'm not really expecting him to be grilling these people. Now, I think a lot of the things I'm saying are really a pro and a con, because he also lets these people dictate the discussion a lot of the time. So if you watch his podcast with Tulsi Gabbard, she mainly shifts it to talking about war. She doesn't really talk in detail about things like, I don't know, Medicare for all or a lot of these other policies. It's mainly focused on one thing. So you have someone like Andrew Yang, where he really hammers home, I guess, automation and UBI, even though he touches on all these other things. So in that way, I think it can be good and bad, because it allows these people to just use Joe Rogan's platform to amplify their views. Now, we are talking about leftist and progressive politics in general, so of course this is a good thing for us. You know, people like Bernie Sanders and Carl Kalinske and David Pakman, they go on this show and they can really amplify their views, get to a brand new audience, people who would have never heard of them before, people who would have never really been open to their politics, but when someone like Joe Rogan interviews them, they start to listen. And I want to prove my point by reading some of the comments on the Bernie Sanders video as the best example I found. So the first comment from a guy called Jack Niels: got to be honest, came into this thinking this guy was absolutely nuts. Left saying to myself, wow, I have been way too closed-minded. Someone called Connor Speed 6 says, the one thing blowing my mind about this entire interview is that I didn't disagree with anything that he is about. Another person called Ninja says, Joe, you did a great job with that interview. Bernie, you seem like the most sensible candidate I've seen in a long time. Someone else called Jay Ferris said, I came into this video with a very negative opinion of Bernie, but after sticking through the whole thing, I have to say I do have some positive thoughts about this guy. In this format, he comes across much better than he does on the soundbite stage I'm used to hearing him on. Good show, Joe. And a final one, Russ Sapoto says, I'm a conservative and decided to listen to this since I'm a huge fan of Joe Rogan, and I had to ask myself multiple times why I was taught to hate the guy. Although I do not agree with some of his policies, most of the things he has stated seem very logical. This also goes to show you can't just skim headlines to paint a picture of a candidate. Even some of the headlines regarding this podcast having to do with his statement about aliens made him seem crazy, even though it was done in good humour. So how refreshing is that to see all these people who would never give Bernie a chance, who would be influenced by the corporate media, who don't really want to give Bernie a fair shake. They all have become more open to his ideas, said about how reasonable he is, and how a lot of them may consider voting for him. So obviously that is great. But I think it also highlights a problem. Like I'm saying, his interview style really has pros and cons. So the cons are, he also has awful people on his podcast, like Gavin McInnes, who was the founder of the Proud Boys. And the Proud Boys are essentially a fascist group that go around beating up leftists and targeting people. So that is obviously awful. He has him on his podcast. people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, who I think are part of the pipeline to the alt-right, and I think Faraday Speaks wrote an article about how the Joe Rogan Experience is part of the pipeline to the alt-right, because you will watch people like Gavin McInnes, you watch Jordan Peterson, and you'll watch Ben Shapiro, and then the YouTube algorithm will start suggesting more of their content, and as you go down the rabbit hole, you get further and further down the political spectrum, I guess, until you get to neo-Nazis. So someone like Ben Shapiro says some awful stuff, right? He basically lately said that he is going to potentially kill someone like Beto O'Rourke if he tries to teach his kids about the LGBT community. So if you're watching someone like that say stuff like that, what other stuff is going to be recommended to you? Do you think it's going to be nice stuff about the LGBT community, or do you think it's going to be even worse stuff? Same with someone like Jordan Peterson. I just made a video about cultural Marxism and how cultural Marxism is essentially fascist propaganda from the 1920s and 1930s. But for example, Jordan Peterson isn't actually a fascist, and he doesn't say that it's the Jews, you know, committing cultural Marxism. He says it's the Marxist. But that is only one step removed from actually just saying what the Nazis used to say. So think about what you might be recommended when someone starts using the term cultural Marxism. And in fact, a lot of the far right and Holocaust deniers actually use this term frequently. So that is the problem with YouTube in general. But now you see the problem. Joe Rogan might start someone off, you know, going down the YouTube pipeline, the YouTube algorithm, until they actually become a neo-Nazi. And I think the problem, as someone who has listened to Joe Rogan for a long time, and when I was more naive, his podcast makes these people seem way more reasonable than they are. And I think that's a massive problem. Because I remember listening to someone like Gary Johnson back in 2016, and I was like, this guy seems alright. Like, he doesn't seem too bad. He's for legalising marijuana, and he seems pretty, you know, good on social issues. I was pretty naive, more like an enlightened left-leaning centrist. Of course, I know now how wrong I was, and then if I listen to some clips of that now, I see how much of an idiot Gary Johnson was. But in that format, he came across as a perfectly reasonable guy and a reasonable alternative to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Perhaps he actually, you know, is one, but at the same time, came across way better than he had any right to. So I feel that is the main problem. But you could reverse it. See what I'm saying? You can say someone watches the Bernie Sanders clips, then they go research Bernie Sanders, or they go on YouTube, it gets more recommendations for them, Bernie Sanders content, they watch Carl Kalinske, they watch David Pakman, and then they go research those guys, or they get recommended their videos. So it's really a double-edged sword. But I think it's worse because I think Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Gavin McInnes, and all these people, they're more on the extreme end of the spectrum. Another person, Alex Jones, for example, I think they're more on the extreme end of the spectrum, and I don't think it's like an equivalent. Carl Kalinske is not the leftist equivalent of Ben Shapiro. And I also don't think there really is an equivocation between leftists and the far right, because the far right generally support awful policies in terms of economic policies, in terms of warmongering. The far right also support awful social policies. They're happy to be racist and dog whistle all the time. Basically, I don't think someone like Carl Kalinske, who's pushing for a better society for everyone, is the same as someone like Ben Shapiro. So I think that is my problem. But people would like to say, if you have Carl Kalinske on, why don't you have Ben Shapiro on? If you have David Pakman, why don't you have Alex Jones? You know what I mean? They say this sort of stuff. But I think Joe Rogan's interview style mixed with having these people on is a lot more dangerous. And Joe Rogan actually addressed this pipeline thing when he was talking to Abby Martin. And he was saying it was ridiculous, but it's not ridiculous. If you're having these awful people on, people watch 3 hours of them talking. YouTube picks up on how many minutes of this content you watch, and it recommends more videos based on how many minutes of this you're watching. So if you're watching 3 hours of Ben Shapiro, if you're watching 3 hours of Jordan Peterson, if you're watching 3 hours of Alex Jones, it thinks, this guy really likes his content, let's keep recommending him similar content. And then you just keep watching it, and then like I'm saying, rabbit hole, you go down, keep watching worse and worse people, and then you end up essentially being a neo-Nazi in some cases. So does Joe Rogan have value to the left? I believe he does. If you just go watch his podcast and you think, huh, that's interesting, I'll watch Bernie Sanders and I'll see what he's all about, I think there is some value to that. But if you listen to every single episode, I think you'll just become a bit of an idiot. And as someone who used to listen to it quite a lot, I can understand how you get so influenced and start thinking people who are not rational are rational, because this format makes them seem friendly, makes them seem nice, makes them seem like they're just rational people, just pushing their ideas out of the goodness of their own hearts, and I think that is obviously quite dangerous. Just to a final point on Joe Rogan himself, he does seem like a pretty alright guy in terms of his political beliefs. From what it seems like, he does believe in things like universal healthcare. He's obviously for marijuana legalization across the whole US. he seems quite receptive to people talking about racism, people talking about, I guess, the private prison industry and how, you know, it's obviously a racist industry, and about the US government generally being racist, and that's something that Cornel West is bringing up. But on the other end of the spectrum, he's not great for things like trans rights. He likes to throw about the terms political correctness and SJWs, and a lot of the people he views as these great intellectuals like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro are obviously, in my opinion, pipelines to the alt-right. Ben Shapiro is just far-right garbage, and Jordan Peterson just pushes fascist myths and has a generally misogynist view of the whole world. So I think, like a lot of people, he's just a massive hypocrite and doesn't know what he really believes. Because I don't know how you can sit down and agree a lot with Cornel West and Bernie Sanders and then talk about how great you think Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro are. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please leave a like and maybe subscribe. If you want to find me on social media, follow me at The Tabernacle on both Twitter and Instagram. I also have a Patreon now, and thanks to all my patrons, and that is just in the description. I also have a WordPress blog, and I'm hoping to start writing a bit more soon because it's the end of the year and the end of the decade. I'm hopefully going to get my top 10s of the decade for things like films and games and movies, and maybe some politics stuff as well. So maybe keep your eye on that. I also live stream every Sunday at about midnight my time, so come join that. It's always a lot of fun. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.